Okay, so today we're doing the family, and I just want to say where we are. We have just experienced the fall, and now they're away from paradise, and paradise is off in the horizon at an inaccessible location, protected by the dancing, flaming sword of the cherubim. So let's get into it. Subtext: the family of Adam. It was to the region of the Mount of Olives that I saw Adam and Eve come. The country was very different from what it is at present, but I was assured that it was the same. I saw Adam and Eve living and doing penance on that part of the Mount of Olives, upon which Jesus sweat blood. They cultivated the soil. I saw them surrounded by sons. They were in great distress, and they implored God to bestow upon them a daughter, for they had received the promise that the woman's seed would crush the serpent's head. Eve bore children at stated intervals. After each birth, a number of years was always devoted to penance. It was after 7 years of penance that Seth, the child of promise, was born to Eve in the grotto of the crib, where also an angel announced to Eve that Seth was the seed given her by God in the place of Abel. For a long time Seth was concealed in that grotto. Likewise in the cave in which Abraham was afterwards suckled, for his brothers, like those of Joseph, sought his life. Once I saw about 12 people: Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, 2 sisters, and some young children. All were clothed in skins thrown over their shoulders like a scapular and girded at the waist. The female dress was large and full around the breast, where it served as a pocket. It fell down around the limbs and was fastened at the side, once under the arm. The men wore shorter dresses, which had pocket fastened to them. The skins from which their dresses were made were, from the neck to the elbow, exceedingly fine and white. They all looked very noble and beautiful in their clothing. They had huts in those days, partly sunk in the earth and covered with plants. Their household was quite well arranged. I saw orchards of low but tolerably vigorous fruit trees. There was grain also, such as wheat, which God had given to Adam for seed. I do not remember having seen either grapevines or wheat in paradise. None of the productions of paradise had to be prepared for eating. Such preparation is a consequence of sin, and therefore a symbol of labor and suffering. God gave to Adam whatever it was necessary for him to sow. I remember having seen men who looked like angels taking something to Noah when he went into the ark. It appeared to me a vine branch stuck in an apple. A certain kind of grain grew wild at the time, and among it Adam had to sow the good wheat. That improved it for a while, but again degenerated and became worse and worse. The wild grain was excellent in those early times. It was most luxuriant further to the east, in India or China, where as yet there were but few inhabitants. It does not thrive where wine is largely made and fish abound. The milk of animals was drunk in those days, and they likewise ate cheese dried in the sun. Among the animals I noticed sheep in particular. All that Adam had named followed him from paradise, but afterward they fled from him. He had to entice them back with food, that is, the domestic animals, and familiarize them to himself. I saw birds hopping about, little animals running around, and all sorts of bounding creatures, such as antelopes and deer. Sorry. The household order was quite patriarchal. I saw Adam's children in their separate huts, reclining around a stone at meals. I saw them also praying and giving thanks. God had taught Adam to offer sacrifice. He was the priest in his family. Cain and Abel were also priests. I saw that even the preparations for their sacrifice took place in a separate hut. On the head they wore caps made of leaves and their stalks woven together. They were shapen like a ship and had a rim in front by which they could be raised from the head. These first human beings had beautiful skin of a yellowish tinge, which shone like silk, and their hair was reddish yellow like gold. Adam wore his hair long. His beard was short at first, but later he let it grow. Eve at first wore her long hair hanging around her, but later on she wound it around her head like a coil, in a coil like a cap. Fire I always saw like a hidden flame, and it appeared to be in the earth. It was given to man from heaven, and God himself taught him the use of it. They burned for fuel a yellow substance that looked like earth. I saw no cooking going on. In the beginning, the food was merely dried in the sun, and the wheat, after being crushed, was exposed under twisted covers to the heat of the sun to dry. God gave them wheat, barley, and rye, and taught them how to cultivate them. He guided man in all things. I saw no large rivers in the beginning, as, for instance, the Jordan, but fountains sprang forth whose waters were conducted into reservoirs. Fresh meat was not eaten before Abel's death. I once had a vision of Mount Calvary. I saw in it a prophet, the companion of Elijah. The mount was at a time full of caves and sepulchres. The prophet entered one of the caves, and from a stone coffin filled with bones he took up the skull of Adam. Instantly an angel appeared before him, saying, "That is Adam's skull," and he forbade its removal. Scattered over the skull was some thin yellow hair. From the prophet's account on what had occurred, the spot was named the place of skulls, Golgotha. Christ's cross stood in a straight line above that skull at the time of his crucifixion. I was entirely instructed that the spot upon which the skull rests in the middle of the earth I was interiorly instructed that the spot upon which the skull rests is the middle point of the earth. I was told the distance east, south, and west in numbers, but I've forgotten them. End of reading. So my first note is just a simple, silly observation. Eve was waiting for a daughter, because she was hoping that a daughter would crush the head of the serpent, right? But kind of makes me think, okay, did she expect to do that within her lifetime? Because I remember reading some of the epistles of Paul and whatnot, and he talks about like the end is near kind of thing. And I guess early Christians thought, well, the end is near, but it was the end of an age, right? It was the end of the age of the age of, I would call it the fifth day of the world, and it started the sixth day of the world, which lasted these 2,000 years. So we often talk about, oh, well, the end is near, but we're coming near the end of the sixth day of the world. This was given in Mystical City of God. I won't elaborate on it, but it's in there, I assure you. And it reminds us that, like, there's a lot of people who came between, you know, the 1750s and now, who thought, oh well, this is the time of the end. This is the time of the end. Even now, we're in this era today, and we're like, well, this is the time of the end. This must be the last times. But in truth, well, God always has different plans than what we imagine them to be. So we should be open to surprises. Okay, so next note. Surreal. One of the reasons why history is such a hard thing to study, and especially for historians to imagine because they have to write it, is that sometimes we can't escape what we know. So they tell writers, they always give them the advice, write what you know. And so if you write what you know, then what happens is you're writing history, but you're really just writing your version of history, which has a heavy bias set upon it, an inescapable bias. Everyone has a bias. You cannot not have a bias. So talking about the bias is almost redundant because everyone has it. Which means there's no such thing as disinterestedness or impartiality. You're always partial towards sin. We are humans. We have that partiality. There's no escaping it. In order to have more impartiality, we have to escape sin. So we may look at a history and say, did that really happen? Because we may have been implanted with other histories. Doesn't matter where. It could be the atheistic evolution. It could have been other religious texts. It could have been another Genesis of sorts. It could be just about anything, because in this quote-unquote age of rationality, we can embrace any irrational idea that comes across our path without any form of divine check to show that it is or is not false. Well, the only thing they allow to be evidence is something they measure with tools, which may themselves be fallible. No one was ever in these places, so they don't know. This is the closest we're ever going to get to fact, is divine revelation from guardian angels or from angels themselves. Because they were there. We're not there. We will never be there. Tools are only going to tell us a little bit of something, but they may tell us skewed data. So this is why I always say to history is always multi-layered. So when people talk about, well, this is what happened 10,000 years ago and this happened 5,000 years ago, are you sure? Are you sure the data wasn't tampered with by the future layers that live between now and that point? We don't know what happened 10,000 years ago, because 7,000 years ago, something different may have happened to overwrite what we would have known from 10,000 years ago. And then we have new layers overwriting the past. We don't know what was overwritten and what was in general the same. And in Genesis, we simply accept the idea that the earth is about 6,000 or 7,000 years old from this present time. So I don't know what earth they were referencing, whether they're referencing livable earth, whether they were referencing an earth in the cradle of Saturn, whether earth was suddenly born in the cradle of Saturn. We don't know these things. But when we get visions like this, we should put more weight in them than we do in our tools, such as carbon-14 dating or whatever, which seems to me unreliable. They say themselves that they throw out all the data they don't like and keep the data they do like. So you can take that with an extreme grain of salt. So when we study history, the only thing we can do is speculate and hold ideas in suspension. I hope everyone knows this. Next note. She said flesh meat wasn't eaten before Abel's death. And it kind of occurred to me that Abel was the first. Abel was the first thing that was slain. So maybe it opened up, like maybe humans just had never thought of killing animals before that. They're just like, well, food is what's grown on trees, isn't it? And then just the thought never occurred to them. Wait a minute, food's running around us. But either way, it's like maybe that would please the vegans and vegetarians. It'd be like, well, not the vegans because they were still apparently drinking the milk of animals. But vegetarians, it'd be like, oh, see, first man was just eating grains and rye and whatnot and fruits. Well, yeah, I mean, and we could just say the idea just never crossed their mind. Ultimately, though, I think if we moved on to a new world, let's suppose that God chastises this world, and in the hypothetical realm, we move on to like a new planet kind of thing. Because we don't know we don't know what God's plans are. Let's suppose that humanity did move on. I'm not sure that we would be slaughtering animals. I think that is just what we would call part and parcel living in this current realm of the world. Now, the current realm of the world has a lot to do with the amount of oxygen in the air and the amount of gravity we currently have. The G-force, which is 9.8 meters per second squared. If we had a different G-force, our life would be considerably different, right? Just in and of itself, in that little factor, our life would be considerably different. But this is the current realm we live in, and these are the little characteristics of the realm. The G-force, the amount of oxygen. And in this realm where we have disease and whatnot, yes, we eat animals. Perhaps just because this is part and parcel of the realm. And my mind would completely be open to the thought that if we entered into a new realm, it is possible that our food or our self-sustenance would have completely different rules applied to it. But as it is, we live in this realm where Cain slew Abel, where we slay animals and we eat them. The last thing, I know there's probably a lot of skeptics who would say, oh, was that real? Was Golgotha really the place where Adam was buried? And things of that sort. But the truth is that yes, God is extremely poetic. When we read this history presented to us by Anne Catherine, why should we be skeptical about it? Why should we be skeptical about a creator who has very poetic designs about our being, because what we're looking at in this humanity, we've lived very short lives. So our experience does not give us a general earthly experience unless we've lived for 500 years. We don't have the general human experience, because what my first point alluded to is what we live in is in the surreal of what other people in the past would have considered. For example, 100 years ago, nobody and okay, I'll think of this one. There's a Serbian mystic named Mitar Terabic. And he said that men will be holding boxes in their hands and they'll be talking to people through boxes. And that is an expression of the surreal we live in, right? Whereas he didn't understand how we could live through cell phones. And us now, it's easy for us to imagine because we see it and experience it. But to him, it was surreal. Yet he only existed such and such years ago. I don't remember what time it was, either in the late 1800s or up to World War II. I don't think he existed after World War II. I don't think he lived past World War II. I don't remember. He was a Serbian mystic, I think. So, and remember, it's Mitar Terabic if you want to look it up. And so we live in a surreal reality, but what was life like 200 years ago? What was life like 500 years ago? What was life like 1,000 years ago? All of this creates these surreal new realities, these tiny little realms we have no idea about. We don't know. And this is why when people recreate like medieval fantasies and stuff like that, and they reintroduce ideas that have died to us, we find interest in them because we always have this intrinsic interest in culture. So anyways, that's all I wanted to say. And yes, we have to accept that God is a poet, that God is extremely artistic. He is the creator after all. Ave Maria.